I remember the argument all too well. It was between me and my dad, and even though he was older and wiser, I knew what was best for me. After all, in my own eyes, I was rapidly growing into the matureness of manhood, all at the ripe age of 12. But on that faithful Sunday morning, I told my dad I didn't want to go to church. I'd rather stay home and watch TV, veg out, play video games, watch football, anything but church. Please, Dad, don't make me go. The argument didn't last long. He looked at me with those fierce, fiery father eyes of his, and he said 3 simple words: "You are going." Right then, I knew the argument was over. And I can tell you, 26 years later, I am incredibly grateful that my parents made church such a high priority for our family. Because it was in the church that I found friends. This came during a time in my life after our family moved from Northern California to Southern California, where I didn't know anybody, and I would spend lunchtime at school hiding in the bathroom. It was in the church where several adults invested in me as a person, would come to my sports games, take me out to coffee, lead Bible studies, show me that I mattered. Because it was in church that I found that I actually had a gift. Who knew? My life had a purpose. It was in church that I found hope as a teenager in a seemingly hopeless world. It was in church that I sensed God calling me into ministry when I was 15 years old. At its best, church should be, could be, a place that nurtures faith in us, that helps us to become the best versions of ourselves. The church should be a place where we find friends and community. It should be a place where we are challenged, where we learn, where we grow. It should be a place where we can come freely to worship God and experience His grace at its best. That's what church should be. But it's not always that, is it? At its worst, the church can cause monumental damage, right? Corruption, hypocrisy, greed, abuse, or just plain old neglect. I know a lot of you have seen it. A lot of people walk away from God not because of the Bible necessarily or because it's something they learned about God, but because of an experience they had at church. Our text this morning is very much about church, what the church could be. As we explore this text, I want to ask 3 what I think are very important questions. Why does the church need to be better? How can the church be better? And when will the church be at its best? First, why does the church need to be better? The answer is simple: because the world needs us to be. There are 2 devastating crises that are happening in our world right now today. The problem of hyper-individualism and the problem of aggressive tribalism. I know they sound like a contradiction, but hear me out. Individualism is the principle of being an individual, being independent, self-reliant, on your own. The iconic image of the rugged individual is the Marlboro Man, looking like John Wayne with his cowboy hat, his box of smokes. The idea is that he's tough. He's a lone wolf. He doesn't need anybody, and he especially does not ask for help. And he never talks about his feelings. Or maybe that's too much of your grandparents' individualism. The individualism of our current culture, especially with today's youth, is more so simply categorized by isolation and loneliness. And kids today are in serious trouble. It's because they've been lied to. They've been tricked into thinking that they can find community on their phone, online, or through social media. In his book, The Anxious Generation, psychologist Jonathan Haidt compares the damage that teenagers especially are experiencing today. He compares that damage of social media to smoking cigarettes. My wife and I have both read the book, and now whenever one of us is caught scrolling on our phone in front of our kids, one of us will say to the other, "So you're just going to light up right in front of the children, are you? Put the cigarette down." Social media is not real community. There's a reason why all of the major owners and operators of the social media companies do not let their own children use them. But even before the dawn of social media, our ties and our connections to people were already suffering. The average American today has half as many friends as the average American did 50 years ago. Almost 10% of American adults have 0 friends. 20% of American adults say they have 2 friends or less. And this hyper-individualism today is leading to crippling loneliness, and it's causing a serious uptick in suicide ideation, suicide attempts, anxiety, depression, addiction to pornography, drugs, alcohol, and of course, screens. So as a pastor, I refer people often to therapists, and I can tell you, every therapist that I know just about is booked out for months because people are so lonely. So we pay people to listen to us. The truth is, we're not meant to go through life as rugged individuals or walking phone zombies, which is why we need the church. We need each other. We need to see a resurgence of people going back to church. Because the image that Paul provides for the church is as connected as you can get. He says the church is one body, joined and knit together by every ligament. You don't get much closer than that. Do you feel like you're a part of the body? We will reach this lonely world by inviting people into relationship. The world needs the church. The other crisis of our world today is that of aggressive tribalism. Now, tribalism in and of itself is not bad. It's really good to be a part of a group, to be socialized, to have community, as long as you understand your values and your sense of self within the group. In psychology, they call this differentiation, and it prevents you from being absorbed into cult-like thinking and behavior. But when tribalism turns aggressive, that's when things go wrong. Now, you know I don't have to spend much time at all talking about this, right? We see it. We are watching the world right now. In 2016, a woman's car broke down in North Carolina, and so she called a tow truck company. And when the tow truck driver got there, he saw that the woman had a Bernie Sanders bumper sticker. And so he got into his car and he left. Later on, he said, "I could not tow her car because clearly she was a socialist. So I got into my car and I felt a deep sense of pride because I had finally stood up for what I believed in." We're talking about a woman who was stranded alone on the side of the road. But does this really shock us? Does it really shock you? I don't think it does. We're watching the news. We're paying attention to social media. We're watching the election, and none of this behavior is shocking anymore, and that in of itself should shock us. And it's on both sides, isn't it? People are demonizing each other, throwing stones, ratcheting up hate. But the world needs to see a better way. What does Paul say about the church? With all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, making every effort to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Are you making every effort possible? Now you might say, okay, well, I can treat, the Christians here at church like that, but not those people out there. They are my enemies. Really? Okay, so let's just imagine that they are your enemies, which I don't think they are. What did Jesus say about our enemies? Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Can we show the world that there is a better way? Why does the church need to be better? Because the world's dying of loneliness. Because people are despairing at the level of hate and division that they're seeing in the world right now. But can we show them something better? We don't have to solve all the world's problems, but you know what we can do? You can be somebody's friend. You can treat people with kindness. The church can be better. Our second question, how? How can it be better? I'll say this, the church is at its best when as many of us as possible are using our gifts for the glory of God and the service of others. That's when the church is firing on all cylinders. Listen to what the apostle says in our text. But each of us was given the grace according to the measure of Christ's gift. And then verse 11 and 12, the gifts he gave were that some would be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for the building up of the body of Christ. And this list here is not comprehensive. In Romans, Paul adds administration, serving, exhortation, generosity. In 1 Corinthians, he adds wisdom, knowledge, faith, healing, discernment. The Bible also talks about people who are musicians, people who are good at hospitality, people who can do art, craftsmanship. Everyone has a gift. Congratulations, you are gifted. And the best churches are the ones where as many people as possible are using their gift to build up the body to love and serve the world. Now, the churches that are let's just say the worst, for lack of a better term, not that we're trying to compare, but the churches that are really struggling are the ones that expect and think that the pastor can and should do everything. Friends, I'm sorry to admit this, but I am terrible at just about everything. It's true. I don't know how to turn on the soundboard. I don't know what kind of software Vicky's using in the back. I don't even know what the word software means. I don't know how to work the coffee machine. I can't fix things the way Jason Lockwood can. I can't balance a budget sheet like Randy or Deward or Tracy. I mean, yeah, obviously I can sing better than Becca, but... Again, we're not comparing. But there are so many people in this church who are already using their gifts. And I'll tell you, the more we lean into that, the more you find a way to use your gift, the more people we're going to reach for Christ. The more lives we're going to change. The more people we're going to bring from a lonely existence into that of a communal existence. every gift matters. This last week I went and visited Janine and Tim King. I know many of you know that Janine is at home battling cancer, and I think they're watching from home online today. But this last week I asked Janine, Janine, how did you come to faith? You know what she said? She was in 3rd grade, and her Sunday school teacher led her to Christ. Her Sunday school teacher. It's not babysitting that's happening down there in that hallway. Think about the legacy of faith of that woman and the King family and all the people who have been impacted by that family because of a Sunday school teacher. Every gift matters. You're not just brewing coffee out there. You're not just shaking hands in here. You're not just asking somebody, how are you doing? How are you really doing? You're not just playing the drums or the guitar. You are literally changing reality itself by showing the love of Christ and welcoming people into the community of faith by using your gift. You're gifted. Imagine what God could do if we all start using our gifts, not just this church, but every church. There's over 2 billion Christians in the world today. Imagine if we all started using our gifts. My last question, when will the church be at its best? I know we all have really high expectations for church, and it's because this really matters to us. This is our church family. This is where we come for community. Our friends are here. A lot of us are raising our kids here or our grandkids here. This is where we learn about faith. This is where we worship the God of the universe. This matters to us. So yeah, we have some expectations of it, don't we? But we have to understand that the church absolutely is going to let us down. But can we fight through that? With patience and grace and gentleness and endurance, can we fight through the weirdness of church? In his book, Life Together, Dietrich Bonhoeffer warns us not to let our ideals of church get in the way of what the church really is. Don't let it destroy what the church is. He says this, "He who loves his dream of a community more than the Christian community itself becomes a destroyer. He enters the community of Christians with his demands, sets up his own law, and judges the brethren and God himself accordingly. But when his ideal picture is destroyed, and it will be, he becomes an accuser of his brethren, an accuser of God, and finally the despairing accuser of himself." Do not let your ideal version of what church should be destroy your experience of what it actually is. Because here is the hard truth of today. The church is a hospital full of sick people. All of us need grace. All of us are broken. But God can use sick and broken people to do amazing things. Like being a Sunday school teacher. The church will not be perfect until that glorious day of Christ's final and triumphant return. But in the meantime, can we keep striving and grinding and trying to make it better than it is? To try and change somebody's life one cup of coffee at a time? Y'all, it matters. Do you believe it? And we do this, we strive to love each other, to reach out to others, because Christ did it for us on the cross. He emptied himself and died on our behalf so that we could live. He died to save us. There is no greater act of love. In 2019, Fred Pepperman was vacationing with his family in Florida. He took his wife and his 4 daughters on vacation because they were celebrating his 28th wedding anniversary. But they didn't know that the winds and the rains from a nearby hurricane had created treacherous waters. And even though the double red flags were out a quarter of a mile away, they were unaware because they were on a private beach at the home that they had rented for the week with no lifeguard. And as they played in the crashing waves, Fred's youngest daughter, Grace, who was 16, got caught up in a fierce riptide. And her 2 sisters, Olivia and Catherine, tried to help her, but they got caught in the riptide as well. And Fred heard his daughters screaming for help. So he jumped in the water, and he swam, and he swam, and he fought the tide, and he got Olivia and Catherine pushed to safety, but he still couldn't get to his youngest daughter, Grace. As he was getting tired, he heard her yell, "Daddy, help me." And so he dug deep, and he pushed himself to the absolute limit, and he got to her, and he pulled her to safety, and his last words to Grace were, "I got you." And that's when he went under. And by the time his body was pulled out of the water, he was gone, but his last words to his youngest daughter were, "I got you." That's a life well lived right there. Fred died saving his children's lives. Would any father do differently if he had the choice? But he died saving his daughters' lives, and I imagine that his daughters are going to go through their life trying to live into that legacy of sacrificial love that their father gave to them. How do we live in to the legacy of love that Christ has rescued and saved us? Before Paul talks about being the church here in chapter 4, he says this right before it in chapter 3. He says, "I pray that you may have the power to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, so that you may be filled with the fullness of God." He says that right there in chapter 3. And then chapter 4, verse 1, he says, "Therefore." I pray that you can comprehend this monumental, sacrificial love of God. Chapter 4, verse 1, "Therefore, be the church." I think there's no more appropriate way for us to prayerfully think through what it means to be the church than when we come to this table on Communion Sundays.